So, what better person to do that than David Dylan Thomas, who is the author of the book Design for Cognitive Bias from a Book Apart and is the creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast. He's developed digital strategies for major clients in entertainment, healthcare, publishing, finance, and retail. He spoke at all different conferences on all different stages. At this point, I'm guessing digital and the before, I keep calling it the before time on actual stages on topics at the intersection of bias, design, and social justice. We want to thank Dave for being here, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks so much. And I'd like to point out today I learned there are two podcasts covering every single film that Keanu Reeves ever made, because Patrick Willems and his crew have one as well. So that's awesome. I'm going to share my screen. And welcome. Thank you all for having me. Welcome to Design for Cognitive Bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. I am David Dylan Thomas, got my own company now. And I wrote a book called Design for Cognitive Bias, as Michelle said. And the road to this book began with a podcast I do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. And the road to that podcast began with this woman. Her name is Iris Bohnet. And she did a talk a while back called Gender Equality by Design. It's an amazing talk. You can find it on YouTube. I highly recommend you check it out. And one of the ideas she puts forward is this notion that a lot of implicit gender or racial bias comes back to basically pattern recognition. So what she means is, imagine you're hiring a web developer, and the image that might pop into your head when I say web developer might be skinny white guy. And it's not because you think that men are better programmers than women, far from it, but the pattern that's been built up in your mind over time from movies or television, or maybe even some offices you've worked in, makes that equation. And so if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit that pattern, all of a sudden you're giving that resume the side eye. Now, when I saw that something as terrible as racial or gender bias could come back to something as simple and, dare I say, as human as pattern recognition, I decided I need to learn everything I possibly can about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is the Rational Wiki page for cognitive biases. It's about 100 or so here. I realized I am not going to figure this all out in a day, so I took just one a day. And this very quickly turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And so eventually my friends were like, Dave, please just get a podcast. So it's worth establishing from the jump, what is cognitive bias? And at the end of the day, it's a series of shortcuts your mind is taking just to get through the day. You have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about where to look, what to do with my hands, how fast to talk. And if I thought about every single one of those decisions very carefully, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that most of our lives are spent on autopilot. But the autopilot sometimes gets it wrong. And we call those errors cognitive biases. Now, here's a fun one. It's called the illusion of control. And it happens when you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a high number, you tend to roll the die really hard. If you need a lower number, you roll it really gently, right? And everyone here knows it makes no difference how hard you roll the die. But in situations where we don't have any control, we like to feel like we have control. And so we embody that desire by how hard we roll the die. Now, this one is not so fun. It's called confirmation bias. And it happens when you have an idea in your head that you just can't let go of. And you really only look for evidence to support that idea. And if you see any evidence that doesn't support the idea, you yell fake news and you move on. So a very powerful example of this came during the Iraq War. So the whole premise was we need to get in there because Saddam has weapons of mass destruction and we need to get him before he gets us. Seemed very plausible. Within a year, the president of the United States, who had insisted there were weapons of mass destruction, said, yeah, we didn't really find anything. Regardless, many people still believed there were weapons of mass destruction there. So many that even 14 years later, over 50% of Republicans and 30% of Democrats believed, yeah, there were weapons of mass destructions there. Now, there's no doubt, knowing this, there's no doubt in my mind that 15 years from now, there will be many people thoroughly convinced that Donald Trump won the election. So this is an extremely powerful bias, and it's one that we are going to come back to. So part of the problem with fighting these biases is you may not even realize you have the bias, right? So there's literally a bias called the bias blind spot, where you think you don't have any biases, but you are sure everybody else does. Part of the problem is about 95% of cognition happens below the threshold of conscious thought. So you're making these decisions so quickly, you don't even realize you've made them. And your mind just sort of makes up the difference later. So the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you know about the bias, odds are you're going to commit it anyway. So there's a bias called anchoring, where I could say, okay, everybody here, write down the last 2 numbers of your phone number. And then I could say, we are going to bid on this bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down lower numbers are more likely to bid lower. Those of you who wrote down higher numbers are more likely to bid higher. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. Now, here's the thing. I could tell you all of that before we do the experiment. Still do it. In fact, I could say, I will give you cash money not to do it. Still do it. Now, the good news is that there are content and design choices we can make that can help keep some of these biases at bay, or maybe even use them for good. And that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. Now, let's go back to Skinny White Guy. Now, in experiment after experiment, if you have 2 identical resumes, and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it is a male sounding name, it tends to continue up the ladder. If it is a female sounding name, it tends to stay on the pile. But here's the thing. Why do you need that information? What about the name? Is it making it easier for you, the hiring manager, to figure out who to hire? Think of it like a signal to noise problem, right? The signal, the thing that is making it easier to figure out are things like qualifications, the experience. What might actually be getting in the way, based on patterns you may have grown up with, are things like gender or race, or what you're reading into the name in terms of gender and race. So City of Philadelphia did in fact do a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position. And one of the things they found out is that even in the high-tech world of web development, the best way to anonymize a resume is to have an intern with no say in the hiring process print it out and physically take a marker and redact it like a CIA document. The next thing they would discover is that if they found a resume they liked, their instinct would be to go to GitHub, which is a code repository, to see that web developer's portfolio. The second they got to GitHub, the profile would load and all the personal information would be there and ruin the experiment. So clever people that they came up with a Chrome plugin that would anonymize that information as the page loaded. And just to complete the circle, they took that code and put it back on GitHub. It's there now if you ever want to try this yourself. Another really important concept to understand is cognitive fluency. And it's this idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's going to be easy to do. But the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's probably hard to do. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been making a lot of pancakes lately. And this is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of small and clumped together. And I glance at that and I think, I don't know, pancakes, I bet pancakes are pretty hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. Now, I can take that same text and give it full width imagery and smaller bursts of text. And I might look at that and think, you know what? I bet pancakes aren't that hard to make. Maybe I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're making pancakes. Now, think about that in the context of deciding, should I drive or take public transportation? I take one look at that printed schedule and I think public transportation is impossible. There is no way, right? I take a look at that app screen, and before I've read a word, I might think to myself, I bet public transportation isn't that hard. Maybe I'll give it a shot. So I can't see your faces, so I'm going to ask you all to vote in your hearts. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? Okay, how many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? Okay, you're both wrong. She was born in 1913. But the point is, most people tend to pick 1914. And the reason is, if something is easier to read, we actually think it's more true. But it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. Now, what's happening here is that we like things that are easy to process. Things that are easy to process feel more certain, and we love certainty. Most bias is just a shortcut to get to certainty, even if we have to throw logic under the bus to get there. So things that are easy to process feel more certain. And I'll give you an example, right? So if I ask you, hey, what did you get for your 5th birthday? You got a toy truck, right? That might not feel too certain, like that answer, right? You might think, I'm not sure about that, right? It's hard to remember. It's hard to process. It doesn't feel very certain. If I said, hey, what'd you have for breakfast this morning? Okay, that might be a little easier to process, easier to remember, feels more certain, right? Things that rhyme are easier to remember, easier to process, feel more certain. Things that use big, bold fonts and clear imagery and a clear language, easier to process, feel more certain. Now, this becomes important when it comes to stuff that we need to believe. There is a crisis in this country where African Americans, generally speaking, do not believe health information that comes from the government. If you look at a 2002 survey, when responding to the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African American respondents agreed with that statement. By the time you get to 2016, that number has dropped to 18%. Now, we could do a whole other Creative Mornings installment about why there are legit reasons African Americans have major concerns about health information coming from the government. But the fact of the matter is, this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language and pictograms, so be it. Now, when I first put this idea in my book, my editor very wisely challenged me and said, okay, that's an interesting idea, but can you point to actual evidence where like plain language and pictograms have saved lives? And I'm glad she did, because it forced me to do the work, and I found some really interesting examples. So this is a situation where you have women who are smoking while pregnant, and when they're presented with materials written at the 3rd grade reading level, right, easier to process, they're more likely to stop smoking during pregnancy and even 6 weeks postpartum. Similar situation, you've got caretakers helping other people take medicine. And when they were given a plain language pictogram-based intervention, you saw decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence to actually taking the medicine. Now you might think, okay, that's great for plain language and pictograms, but rhyming, really? Let's talk about click it or ticket. So not too long ago, you have all these states roll out legislation that says if you don't buckle your seatbelt, you're going to get a ticket. And the legislation on its own did pretty well, especially with older drivers, but not as much with younger drivers. So they roll out click it or ticket, and the results are national belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moves from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. Now, just to put that in more human terms, every percentage point you go up and people buckling their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So if you do the rough math, that's almost 4,000 lives saved, in part through rhyming. It is silly, but it works. Now, the most dangerous bias in the world, in my opinion, is the framing effect. And it starts out fairly innocently. Let's imagine you go into a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean, right? And next to it is a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which one do you think people are going to line up for? It's the same thing. I've framed one, though, in a way that makes it more appealing. Now, that's all good and well when we're talking about beef, but what if I say, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? You see what I did there? We're no longer talking about if it's a good idea to go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. If you are multilingual, you actually have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you can think about the decision in your non-primary language, you are less likely to fall for the scam. So I speak a little bit of French. So if I were to think about the beef decision, it would go something like this. Let's see, beef, that's boeuf, that's a lot of vowels. 95%, that's 89 maybe, right? And by the time I've done all that processing, I see right through the scam because I've slowed down my thinking. Thinking in my non-primary languages forces me to slow down my thinking, and bias is something that happens when we're thinking too fast. It's urgent, we gotta make a decision, right? You slow that down, you're more likely to see through the scam. Now, the framing effect can be used for good. So there's an experiment where you show an audience a photo like this and you ask them, should this person drive this car? And what you'll get is basically a policy discussion, right? And some people will say, oh, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And other people will say, oh, how dare you, that's ageist. People should do what they want. All you're gonna learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now you can show the exact same photo to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what you get is a design discussion. And some people might say, well, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? And other people might say, well, what if we move the dashboard? And what you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. Now, I only changed like 2 words, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I changed the entire conversation. In fact, what if I iris out a little more and I ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why the guy was in the car in the first place. He was here, but he wanted to be there. And if I frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. I want to close by talking about our own cognitive biases, because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. So I told you we come back to this. For a long time, I had a complete misunderstanding of what the scientific method was. I thought it was, I have an idea about how the world works. I am going to test that idea. And if I get a good result, I'm going to write down what I did. And a whole bunch of other people are going to try the same thing. And if they get a good result, yay, I get to write that down as a law, and we move on to the next thing. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out it's a little more complicated. I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea. And if I get a good result, I'll write down what I did. A whole bunch of other people are going to try the same thing. If they get a good result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Okay, let me go and try and prove that. That is a much more rigorous approach, and it was invented specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as designers, it's very easy for us to leave good design on the table because we fall in love with our first idea. Let me show you how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game with a computer, and the computer's going to say, okay, I'm going to show you these numbers and that question mark. You put whatever number you want where that question mark is, and I'll tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you're ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. Now, if you're like me, the very first number you try is 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that number fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, nah, I got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And it says no because I never tried this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is simply that every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution. Probably easier to code, probably cheaper to build. But I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are tools out there to help us avoid this outcome. One of them is called Red Team, Blue Team. And the idea is you have a blue team who does the initial research and maybe gets as far as a wireframe. But before they go any further, a red team comes in for one day. And the red team's job is to go to war with the blue team. They're there to find out every hidden assumption, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team missed because they were so in love with their initial idea. And I like this approach because it's fairly economical, right? I don't have to go to my boss and say, hey, from now on, we got to hire 2 teams for every project and they got to check each other's work every day. No, I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely that we're going to put something harmful out into the world. Now, a good tool for a red team is something called speculative design. And it's a way to explore the unhappy path, right? So it's a lot like that show Black Mirror, which if you've never seen it, it's kind of like a Twilight Zone for tech. And you take some near future technology and you tell a story about what would happen if real human beings got their hands on it. And it's always terrible. In fact, I think anybody working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode about it first. So this is a real job. The folks at Superflex went down to the United Arab Emirates to help them figure out the future of energy. And the question on the table was, should we continue down the road of fossil fuels or should we start investing in renewables? One of the things Superflex did was to say, okay, let's figure out what your air quality is going to be like if you stay on the road of fossil fuels 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out. But they didn't just figure it out. They modeled it. And then they made them breathe it. And by the time you get to about 10 years out, it is unbreathable. So at the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they were going to invest $150 billion in renewables. Another great tool you can use at the beginning of a project to kind of get all your biases out on the table is called an assumption audit. And the idea is you get your team in a room before you kick off and you ask these 5 questions. 1, what identities does your team represent? And you're only going to self-identify as you feel comfortable, but you're going to think about things like gender or age or income or neurodiversity. Then you're going to ask, how might those identities influence the outcome of this thing we're making? Then you're going to ask, well, who isn't in the room? Anybody here ever been incarcerated? Anybody here live below the poverty line? Then you're going to ask, how might the absence, right, of that perspective influence the outcome of this project? And finally, you're going to ask, what might we do to include, honor, and give power to these perspectives in our design process? And I choose those words carefully, right? Include, certainly talk to people, honor, maybe pay them for their time, give power, right? Who in this scenario has very little say in the outcome of this design process, but is going to be highly impacted by the outcome of this design process? And how can we give them more power? Because they are going to have to live with the thing we are making. The last bias I want to talk about is called the déformation professionnelle. Told you I speak French. And it's a bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job, which in the workaholic world we live in might seem like a good idea, right up until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di up the road that night probably thought they were doing a good job. And technically speaking, they were. They were getting really difficult to get photos that were going to fetch them a really high price. What they weren't doing such a good job at was being human beings. Now, the former police commissioner of Philadelphia, a guy named Ramsey, when he took the job, asked all of his officers the same question. What do you think your job is? And most of them answered to enforce the law. And he said, okay, that seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I told you your job is to protect civil rights? Now that encompasses enforcing the law, but it's a bigger job because it forces you to treat people with dignity. Now I've had this slide in here since 2017. And last year it suddenly became more visible and more visceral. And I started to get much more emotional when I got to the slide, but I kept it in here because now more than ever, it is clear how we define our jobs is a matter of life and death. Now, Ramsey was telling his officers that day, look, your jobs are harder than you think. And I'm here to tell us our jobs are harder than we think. It isn't just design cool shit. We have to find a way to define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, people are working on this already. You've Mike Montero out at Mule Design creating a design ethics booklet that's basically a Hippocratic oath, a first do no harm for designers. You have the Design Justice Network, who's doing amazing work in this area. And they have these 10 principles. I'm just going to read you the first two. 1, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. 2, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. Now, if you just try to stick to those first two, you have got your work cut out for you. It's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. We often think we're doing the former when we're actually doing the latter. Another great intervention for this is called the Tarot Cards of Tech. And it's this website you go to and there are these cards and you click on them and they flip over and they give you these really provocative questions about the thing you're working on. How might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your product change cultural habits? Now, if Twitter had asked itself this before it launched, we might see a very different world today. You even see this playing out in the world of software engineering, right? You have the Never Again pledge, which a lot of software engineers took when they saw that their data work was being used to hurt immigrants. And they pointed to a very long history of data being used to hurt excluded populations. And they said, we don't want to be a part of that history. And here's a list of things we're going to do to make sure that doesn't happen, up to and including destroying unethical data sets. And we're starting to see this kind of collective action play out at places like Google, where you had Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. And when the people working on it saw what was happening, they said, look, we didn't get into this business to make weapons. If you make us work on this, we're going to walk. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million project with the military. And then they turned right around and did Dragonfly, which is censored search in China. So the battle continues. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this is not some software guru at a TED Talk. It's Martin Luther King. Over 50 years ago, he saw this to be true, and it is only more true today. So the challenge I'll put to ourselves is, how might we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was really insightful and amazing. We want to open this up to questions and conversation. And I'm going to just change the settings here so that you all can unmute yourselves. And Laura, if you don't mind maybe jumping in and we can curate a little Q&A. Are you able to unmute, Laura?
Yes.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Raise your hands either in your little Zoom box or raise hands by clicking the raise hand button. And that was, wow, Dave, thank you so much. That gave me so much to think about.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Wow.
I mean, even the reframing, Dave, when you said how we define our jobs as a matter of life or death, I mean, even it sounds simple in concept, just to reframe how we're asking, we're thinking about it as, for leading companies or making hiring decisions, to be able to, just that little switch would make all the difference, make a lot of difference.
Yeah, and I think it's about bringing our whole selves to work too, right? I feel like we make this distinction between our professional lives and our personal lives, and COVID has obviously broken that down quite a bit, right? How many of us are dressing differently for business meetings now, right? But I feel like it's urging this bigger interrogation of like, why are we asking our professional selves to be different from our personal selves, and our professional goals to be different from our personal goals? And is that a good idea, right? This whole notion of business and ethics being this dichotomy, it's like you got to choose one or the other. Like that should trouble us.
Right.
Yes.
Totally.
It looks like Ivy has a question.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, this has been a really terrific way to wake up on a Friday morning. I really appreciate everything you've done. Can't wait to read your book, actually. But the reframing question, and thanks for bringing up, Laura, is really critical, but it's how do we learn how to reframe in a way that is inclusive versus exclusive? Are there certain tools or things that you've read about that are going to improve our awareness and drive change in the way we frame a question?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think a lot of it comes down to question design. I actually have a whole other talk about this, but the Convergence Center for Public Policy is a group in DC, and their whole job is to bring people to the same table who hate each other. And one of their secret weapons is question design. So if the issue were food deserts, you might think, oh, the question we're going to talk about is how do we bring healthier food into the supermarket? But weird as it may sound, that framing is actually very controversial. And there isn't a lot there for like marketers or even for some grocery store owners, right? The question they might frame is, how might we work together to shift consumer demand to healthier consumption? Now, they've done a few things there, right? The phrase shift consumer demand is immediately going to be interesting to anybody who's into marketing, food production, anybody who makes money off of food, because you've just described a white space, right? I could get in the ground floor of that. So I definitely need to be a part of that conversation. And healthier consumption, obviously anyone who lives in that neighborhood or who cares about healthy food is going to be interested in that. So the art is that they have crafted a question that everybody can see themselves in and see themselves contributing to and see themselves benefiting from. And the real like masterstroke, in my opinion, is the first bit. How might we work together? You can't answer the question without also describing how you're going to work together. So that is an art, right, that they've crafted over time. But and that's one of many different things you can do to create the environments necessary for an inclusive conversation, but it's key, right? And the art of doing it, honestly, is you take the initial question. So let's go back to the example of how might this person drive this car? And you say, well, what is that question? Or even go further back, should this person drive this car? And you ask yourself, what's the question behind the question? Why are we asking that question? And the issue that question is really trying to get at is public safety. Like, how do we make sure that people are able to move around in a safe way? And then you say, okay, well, let's just ask that question then. How do we do a better job of moving people around safely? And if you answer that question, you are also going to answer the should this person drive this car question, but you're not going to focus on that part of the question, which is the part that's very exclusive and hot button. The how can we move people around safely is something everybody can get on board with. Everybody wants to move around safely. And there's even a financial interest in people being able to move around safely, right? So like all the different people who would have a say in that space can see themselves in it. So it's really the art of it is say, what is the question behind the question? What is it actually trying to accomplish? Okay, let's just ask that question because that's the question that people can really see themselves in.
Thank you, Dave. And the way that you describe that makes it sound easy, but it's actually incredibly.
Oh, like that's why they have a whole center for it.
Yeah. A question came in the chat, and then Xenia will take your question next. The one in the chat is, what illustration can someone present to shareholders to shift the focus to user-centered design after a long history of shareholder-centered design?
So there is a sneaky answer and an honest answer, right? And the honest answer is wait. The sneaky answer is, and again, I have a whole section in this, actually a whole new talk now about this, but it's basically a whole series of things about how to Jedi mind trick your boss. Because basically, remember I was saying like 95% of your decisions are happening below the threshold of conscious thought. Your shareholders, your stakeholders, they're also making most of their decisions 95% below, right? And what you need to do is figure out what's going on in that 95%. And there's any number of biases they're succumbing to, which if you understand what they are, you can learn to kind of navigate. So for example, part of it, like if you think about the shareholder piece of it, it's about not trying to convince shareholders that your problem is important and that they need to solve your problem. It's more about helping them understand that no, their problem and your problem are the same problem. So a great example of this, Stacey Abrams talks about trying to get environmental legislation through where she was and having to deal with Tea Party people to do it. And what she did was she didn't try to go in there and convince them that climate change was real. Like that's she was just going to be banging her head against the wall. What she did was she tried to convince them, the way she put it, I love this phrase, she tried to convince them that property taxes were real, right? And the argument wasn't, oh, you need to deal with this environmental legislation because it's good for the environment. It's like, you need to deal with this environmental legislation because if you don't, property taxes are going to drop, right? Because no one wants to live underwater. So that was convincing, right? So she took something that they cared about and framed what she wanted them to do in terms of that and how it was going to further what they needed. Because no one's sitting around, unless they're a really good leader, frankly, no one is sitting around in their office thinking, gee, I wonder what everyone else's problem is so I can solve it. Most people are sitting in their offices thinking, how am I going to get my bonus? How am I going to get all this product shipped? How am I going to keep from getting fired? So if you walk in the door with, hey, here's an additional problem on top of all the problems you're dealing with, it's going to be very difficult for them to hear you. If on the other hand, you walk in and say, hey, I remember the other day you said you were having a problem with this. I think I figured out a way to solve it. I think I figured out a way for you to get your bonus. I think I figured out a way to keep you from getting fired, right? All of a sudden, they're all ears, right? So I think that when you're trying to, shift someone's frame around, I'm a shareholder, so I want you to solve my problems, solve their problems, but just do it in a way that aligns with the problem that actually you want to get solved.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Xenia.
Thank you. Had a question around, you mentioned that you did investigation around different biases. So all that you've come across, which one surprised you the most and why?
That's interesting. So I think that the one that surprised me the most is something called system justification bias. And it surprised me because, like a lot of people, I thought that the reason that people who don't make a lot of money vote for tax breaks for the rich is because they think they'll be rich someday. And when they actually did the work to go in and say, is that the case? What they found out is no. People who don't make a lot of money and are still voting for tax breaks for the rich have no illusions about the fact that they are never going to have a lot of money. They are never going to be rich. They truly believe it is right and just for rich people to have good things. Full stop. And that was a very important understanding for me. It was a surprise, but then it became like, oh, right. Because people have a certain way that they think the world should work, regardless of where they fit into it, right? And they're going to vote in ways that support their worldview. And going back to, remember I was saying people love certainty. A world in which everything has its place, and the rich get what the rich deserve and the poor get what the poor deserve, is actually very certain. Like, it gives you a lot of certainty. A world in which your position in that world is messed up and you have no control over it, that's not a very comfortable world to live in. And it requires a lot of thinking and a lot of decision making about, do I fight that? Do I not fight that? Can I afford to fight that? Like, this isn't right. The whole world is wrong. The whole world is wrong is a much less certain place to live in than the whole world is right. And so I can sympathize. It's way easier to get through a difficult day if everything is in its right place, including you. So, but system justification bias is a powerful thing. So when you hear people and they're like, well, why do people vote against their best interests? They're not. They're voting very much in what they believe their interests are, whether it's, and this is a whole other topic, but whether it's, hey, if I vote this way, and this goes to like immigrants voting for policies that benefit white people. If I vote this way, I get to be white too, which is a thing. If you look back at like how many immigrants voted for Trump the last time, it was more than the number of immigrants who voted for Trump the first time. Like, that's where that comes from. Or if it's, I'm voting in my best interest because this is what I believe. Like, That guy said he was smart enough to get around, taxes. People who are able to, screw the system deserve rewards. I'm going to reward them, right? This is the way the world is. This is the way the world should be. So that if you want to understand why people do what they do, understand how they think the world should be. Then most of their decisions will make perfect sense. But that was a big surprise for me because I was sort of under this notion that it was all self-interest, right? It was all like, oh, they're thinking the way I'm thinking. And if I were in that position, I'd think, oh, the reason I would do that would be that I would be rich someday. So I don't want to screw myself over. It's like, no. Don't think about what you would do. Find out what they believe. Then you'll have a better understanding of why they're behaving the way they're behaving. Hi, Neil.
Hi, David. Let me throw a question at you. I'm curious whether or not education makes it easier to understand some of the concepts you're talking about, but maybe even more important, equally, is age and where you are in your learning process. Thought I have is, would it be better for you and people who understand what you're about to talk to K to 12 year age kids than it is to talk to professionals like us?
Absolutely. I mean, part of the problem, and I'm personally learning more about this, like this is my point in the journey, where I'm really trying to understand early childhood's influence and all this stuff, because these biases come from somewhere. They don't just pop out of thin air and I believe that rich people should have good things. No, that came from somewhere. That came from my mom and dad never being able to afford things, and me seeing rich kids at schools being able to afford things and thinking, oh, they must be doing something right, right? There's any number of ways, but all those things happen as I'm starting to learn or explore or interrogate in early childhood. So absolutely, if I can get in front of some kids and be like, hey, look, the world isn't the way you think it is. But it's difficult because when you're that age, you actually need stuff to be simple. You need certainty in a way that you don't need when you're older, right? And I can even see this play out with my son, right? My son is very didactic. And part of it is he needs to be didactic because he's just trying to figure out what is going on in the world. When you ever play a game where like you don't know the rules before and you just sort of show up in the world of the game and you have to kind of figure out the rules as you go, right? You need things to be fairly black and white early in the game. It's like this button does this thing and this thing only. Okay, got it. And if it's like any more complicated than that, you're never going to get anywhere. So I feel like early childhood and like basically between 1 and 20, you need things to be fairly rigid just so I can know what to do. Once you've mastered that part, then it's like, okay, now we can talk about gray. Now we can talk about all those things. So I feel like it is probably a subtle art, but I've also learned over time that kids can appreciate things with much more subtlety than we give them credit for. I remember I was teaching a class of 6th graders screenwriting, and I was just going to sort of be very basic about it. But then I was like, okay, there's this really great lecture I got when I was in college about the second scene in Psycho. The second scene in Psycho is just a scene where a guy walks into an office with a secretary, and there's this whole conversation about the dowry he's trying to do. And if you actually watch the scene, Hitchcock is throwing in all these like really interesting subtexts around motherhood, around communicating that Mary needs money. Like all this work is being done very subtly. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to see if they get that. So I showed them the scene and I unpacked it for them, and they were like, yep, totally get it. Right. So 6th graders were getting subtext in a Hitchcock film that I didn't understand until I was in college. So I'm like, so while I agree that it needs to be done well, I actually think it could happen. I think you could teach, kindergartners some degree of cognitive bias, and then it could be a tool they could use to interrogate their own reactions to things. Because that's what it really ends up being about. It's like not just saying, hey, I'm reacting to this, so let's just go. It's being able to take that extra step of like, okay, I'm reacting to this. Wait, but why? Is that really how I want to react? Right? That's the step most people miss.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Dave Odegaard has a question.
Yeah, Dave, thanks for doing this at this time for me, because this is the first. I think.
Yeah, I always feel bad. Like anybody in Europe's like got to be like up at midnight to watch my stuff.
Yeah, so I was so happy that you're like. I was like, yes, I can finally do this, and it's like during the day. So, but it's also my question fits perfectly with your answer that you just gave. I'm kind of interested in how do you? I think based on what you've said before, we have a lot of people who are, have a lot of cognitive bias. And how do we first begin that conversation with someone who is no longer a child, who has all this bias, how do we say, get them to get that reflective moment, that self-reflective moment of saying, hey, you may be having there's this thing called cognitive bias. You may have a bias. How do you get them to look at that in the first place, and then have these later conversations about the different types and how to overcome biases and stuff like that? So yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of it is kind of my approach, right? It's like approaching it in this very non-judgmental way where I can like show you, hey, here's where I screwed up. Does that sound familiar? So like the thing I did with the numbers, right? I didn't say, oh, you stupid audience, look, you're going to pick 8. I wouldn't pick 8, but you did. You're stupid, right? No, I said like, I don't know about you, but I'm going to put 8. And theoretically, you're watching that going, yeah, I'd probably pick 8. And then I'm like, oh yeah, I'm an idiot. It's like, and I don't want you to think, oh, I'm an idiot. It's like, oh yeah, he's an idiot. But why is he an idiot? Oh, because of that. Okay, no, that's good to know, right? So it's this way of sort of like, I'll play the fool so that you don't have to, but then you'll sort of realize, oh, I'm not going to say it, but I kind of did the same thing. All right, I get it. Okay, right. So I'm trying to take the pressure off, because a lot of especially with the word bias, right? It's shame, right? Nobody wants to feel shame. So if I can take some of the pressure off of that and demonstrate and tell you a story that demonstrates what happens when you think a certain way, I'm not saying you're thinking that way. I'm saying, hey, be kind of bad if someone, or it could be kind of unfortunate if someone thought this way, right? Okay, and then you can say, yeah, I'm not going to do it, but you can't help but notice, right, when you're doing that. So I think those are the approaches to take, approaches that kind of allow for a certain grace and humility for the person involved, so they don't. So it's not accusatory. It's not this thing of like, you're biased. It's like, okay, my only course of action now is to say, no, I'm not. You know. So I think that's part of it. But the other thing I would say that I want to like point out here is that even if I can do that, right? Even if like I can put you in a box, and when you go in the box, you don't know you have bias. And when you come out of the box, you're like, I've got bias. That's not going to help. Or more to the point, it's not going to necessarily result in different behavior, because like I was saying, even when you know about the bias, he's still committed. So I think it's important to understand the difference between making someone aware of their bias and changing their behavior. And an example I want to give is Don't Mess with Texas. Don't Mess with Texas originated as an anti-littering campaign. Texas highways were in terrible shape, and nothing anyone tried could keep people from littering. So they rolled out Don't Mess with Texas. And the brilliance of Don't Mess with Texas is it didn't try to convince everybody of the value of the environment, or that, you know, climate change was real or anything like that. All it did was start with a simple premise that everyone could agree with. If you live in Texas, I don't care if you're red or blue, you believe that Texas is awesome. That's just ground truth, table stakes, right? So it took that and said, well, that's a nice state you got there. Be a shame if something were to happen to it, right? And so Don't Mess with Texas became something everyone could get behind, and they could frame the act of littering as messing with the state of Texas. And then all of a sudden, every good old boy is like, well, what did you just throw something out of that car? Do not mess with Texas, right? Now, did I actually make them aware of their bias that, the environment is crap and we shouldn't care about it? No, I didn't convince anybody to become an environmentalist, but did I get them to stop littering? Yes. So understand that while it's not a bad thing, I'm not questioning the value of the goal. Yes, it's good for people to be aware of their bias. Don't confuse that with changing their behavior, right? And there's definitely some overlap there, but that I always try to caution that when people ask, well, how do I make someone aware of their bias? Because I don't want them to think that, well, if I make them aware of their bias, they'll stop, right? Not really, no.
Thank you. Dave, as you're talking, that a word that keeps coming into my head is empathy, and I don't hear you using that word, but so much of what you're talking about involves me putting myself into somebody else's situation. And tagging onto what Neil suggested earlier, you can definitely teach that to children starting day one.
Yeah, and it's not even like teaching it, right? It's just like getting them to listen to it, because empathy is something that's built into us. If you watch a movie and someone breaks their leg, you go, oh, right? Or even when Justin was telling the story about cutting open his finger, I was like, get that? That's empathy. That's you seeing someone in pain and having a pain response, right? You don't need to teach that. You just need to you basically need to keep people from unlearning it and saying, yeah, empathy is nice, but capitalism, right? If you can put that empathy shit aside for a second, we can make some money, right? That's the part, right? You want to interrupt. But I think the reason I don't explicitly talk about empathy is A, that's not my area of expertise, but B, empathy is coming for a beating lately. So I just came back from IXDA, and the two things that were just like torn apart were design thinking and empathy, right? And it's not that empathy was bad, it was that empathy isn't enough. So Ariba Jahan gave an amazing talk on this, talking about her own experiences as a person with hearing loss around the people trying to help her had a lot of empathy, but it was empathy that was too self-centered. So it'd be people saying, I feel bad for you. Let me teach you how to hide your, how to wear your hair long so you can hide that ear implant. Or let me teach you how to lower your expectations so you don't get disappointed when you try to get a real job, right? That was coming from a place of empathy, but it wasn't coming from a place of understanding. It wasn't coming from a place of actual inclusion. It wasn't coming from a place from really truly understanding the needs of the other person and what they wanted. It was really saying, I'm gonna put myself in your shoes. And like I was saying before, I'm gonna put yourself in your shoes and I'm gonna think about what I would want in that situation, which is better than psychopathy, which is to say, I don't care what you want at all. I'm gonna get what I want. Like, we don't wanna go that far back. The empathy gets us past that. But to go further to actually helping, we need that extra step, which involves more of really, inclusive design and really hearing what the other person is saying and trying to figure out what their goals are and where they're coming from, rather than try to interpret it through the lens of our bias, right? That's the trick. Like, empathy with bias just gets you patriarchy, right? Patriarchies think they're doing a great job of taking care of everybody. The British Empire thought they were being amazing to the Indians, right? Look, we got you like all this water, and we got you like, the Roman Empire thought, hey, we brought you aqueducts. Why are you complaining about being slaves, right? So empathy can actually, and again, that's better than just saying, well, I don't care if you starve, I'll just kill you. Like, that's better, right? A lack of empathy indicates psychopathy, but you want to go further if you want real change. So that's why I don't talk about it as much. I kind of want to like skip to the end.
I hear you. I hear you. Well, we do have time for a couple more questions if folks have them. And they've been wonderful, wonderful questions so far. Great conversation. Thank you. I don't see any hands waving. Dave, do you have any closing comments that you would like to leave us with?
Yeah, support Black business. Sorry, when everyone asks that question, I'm just like, I got that ready to go. I'm like,
good.
Support Black business. Go to rebuildblackbusiness.com. They've got over 14,000 Black businesses to choose from. I'm sure you'll find at least one with something you want. So yeah, support Black business.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you. It was wonderful talking with you this morning. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we hope to see you all next month.
See everybody. Thank you.